Welcome back to another Reconstruction video. Most of these are designed obviously for my Granite Bay High School AP US History kids. For those of you who might be joining on for whatever reason, just trying to grab information from wherever you can, I'm Brandon Dell'Orto, AP US History teacher at Granite Bay High School. And this is my son's bedroom. He is in the Army. That's why we got our Army things and our Navy things and our flag. Anyways, so we're talking about Reconstruction, and we've been working on so far is the idea of trying to break it down into economic, social, and political elements of the war, and actually the bringing back of the states. So Reconstruction is the bringing back of the Southern Confederate states. And sorry, my kind of like head's like over that side. Not that I want to put myself over the Confederate soldier there, but Reconstruction is bringing in those 11 Confederate states. And what does it mean? Now, on the political cartoon that you can see over here on the left, your left, my right. In essence, what you have is a kind of an example of a Thomas Nast cartoon that definitely illustrates the idea of race issues in terms of social issues. And this part of the cartoon right there has, in essence, an element that is very telling. You have Lady Liberty over here in the corner. In essence, her torch of freedom has gone out. But focusing on down here, you have, in essence, the idea of these black politicians during the age of radical Reconstruction when they are allowed to not only vote but run for office. And in all 11 Confederate Southern states that have been brought back to the Union, they have a moment of radical rule, they call it, where white and black politicians are working together. And so what you have in this cartoon, in essence, is not only are the black politicians being portrayed as like apes and uncontrollable and kind of like warlike, you can actually see the white people in the background with their arms over their shoulder, crossed over their arms. These guys throwing up hands and kind of like, I don't know what else we can do. This guy even saying, man, these people smell. So there's elements of race and racism embedded in this time period. It's also important to remember that when we talk about the Reconstruction and the aftermath of Reconstruction, it's not just about Reconstruction. It's going to be the template from which all race issues then go into the future. By 1880, the census basically counted, as you can tell on this, that most of the actual Americans who are African-American descent, former freed slaves now, are living in the South, the same Confederate South that you had before. West Virginia being the kind of little baby new state made by Lincoln in the Civil War. Other than that, there's not many blacks living anywhere outside of the Confederate South. A little bit in New York, a teeny little bit in Delaware, New Jersey, are actually none showing up in New York itself, and a bit in Missouri and a bit in Kansas. But by and large, those are the exodusters we'll talk about later on. 1880, 15 years after the Civil War, they're still living more or less in the South where they'd always been. 40 years later, so we're talking now 55 years after the Civil War is over, most of the blacks in America are still living in the Deep South. Now, we know the basic story of the KKK and the rise of anger and hatred and persecution of black people in the South. So the question that I always had in high school was, why did they not leave? And the answer we got generically from both textbooks and the teachers that we had was, well, this is kind of their home. This is where they knew where they belonged. This is where they were comfortable. This is where their friends were. They knew the traditions of the South. And the reality is a lot different than that. Not only were they not really wanted in northern areas, in many states like Abraham Lincoln's adopted home state of Illinois, having been born in Kentucky, had anti-free black laws. In other words, no blacks were allowed to live in their state for a decade or more after the Civil War is over. What you also have, in essence, is a series of things designed by the Jim Crow Black Code laws that we talked about last lecture with economics, where the blacks were not allowed to leave because they couldn't. They were vitally economically necessary to the production of all the cash crops, most importantly, cotton, king cotton, again, in the South. So it's not as simple as basically what we've been often told in this story. And if you even just go back and forth and look at these two, it's hard to tell the difference from 1880 to 1820. All right, so let's start with John C. Calhoun. John C., chest hair, coming out, neck hair, keeping his neck warm, although I don't know on South Carolina why you might need that. Don't look into his eyes because they'll steal your soul. Here is the quote. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That may not be John C. Calhoun's accent, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty certain it's not going to sound like a British guy. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And as much as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I am, as much as any other man, in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. I say upon this occasion that because the white man is to have the superior position, the Negro should be denied everything. I do not perceive they should be denied everything. Now, this is a bad quote, all things concerned. I mean, this is fundamental racism at its core. And we've come to believe that of John C. Calhoun and many of the South that had come to believe that Southern slavery was a peculiar institution, a necessary evil, later on a positive good. But it's harder when you think that this actually isn't John C. Calhoun. This is actually this guy's quote, Abraham Lincoln, in a debate with Stephen Douglas, the Little Giant, in 1858. One of the things we have to remember when we talk about social elements of the Reconstruction era and the things that will happen because of it is that the United States has been a racist nation from the beginning, and we still struggle with it. And so this is part of the time period. Abraham Lincoln wasn't speaking outside of the basic mindset of the time. So it's important to remember this as we go through this process of understanding that when it comes to this time period, it's not so much the idea that there is just freedom, 13th Amendment, emancipation. But we tend to look back at it and think that equality came at the same time, but that is in no way, shape, or form true. Equality and emancipation are not the same things. It's important to remember this as we go through this process. When the Southern states seceded, and it started there in South Carolina on December 20th, 1860, and then kind of fled to the other 6 states, and then eventually 11 total, they created their own kind of new constitution based on some of the mindsets of what John C. Calhoun, let me just cover his eyes, John C. Calhoun and people like him had wanted to have done in the time period. So their new constitution of the southern states had a lot of elements to it that were very similar. We, the people of Confederate states, each state acting in sovereign, independent character in order to form a permanent federal government, establish justice. And basically, they just copied the Constitution of the United States. And then they added some stuff. They basically said slavery is a right. It's more or less right up there with freedom of speech and everything else that you got in the regular Constitution. Tells you a little bit that they're still pissed off with the tariff, so no protective tariff, no American system. In essence, there's like a 2/3 vote, supermajority needed for spending tactics, and the president was for 1 year. But John C. Calhoun, dead now by 1850, has Alexander Stephens from Georgia as the vice president, and he, in essence, says a very telling element in this kind of inaugural address. Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination of the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. We can't really explain the social issues of Reconstruction without really wrapping our heads around the idea that racism was a given in this time period. It was a rare thing to have somebody who believed something other than this. So this is a speech he's given at the time period. Now remember, there are those radical Republicans, for example, who have been pushing for things like equality. And they, as we talked about last time, would push for things like a super high tariff, income tax, things like that. But they also pushed the Homestead Act, if you remember reading about that or listening to it, and then the contract labor law. So what we have in this time period is an interesting combination. We have a bunch of laws being pushed through in 1862 that are going to have some interesting ramifications. Take a look at the Irish immigration in the United States from 1825 to 1920. The Irish are going to be one of the few countries that just gets so hammered by the potato famine, the potato blight of the 1830s, 40s, 50s, that their population actually diminishes over time by both disease, deaths, and then emigration out of the country. This then shows you that they started coming into the United States in pretty big waves around the time period of the 1840s and 50s. And this is going to bring about things like the Know Nothing Party, that had at its core the idea that America is for Americans, build the wall, let's keep the Catholics out. They don't understand the idea of the Holy Bible. And here's you have a very young Uncle Sam basically kind of whittling away over here. Brother Jonathan is what he was called at the time period. We're trying to keep all the papists, all the popes, all the Catholic people out. Now, the American Know Nothing Party is one of those third parties that has always been an intriguing one. They kind of created the image of the ideal Uncle Sam's youngest son, this kind of perfect American citizen. That looks like somebody from second period. But anyways, one way or another, the idea of the Know Nothing Party was out there for a long time. And it wasn't just anti-Irish, it was also anti-German, anybody that was Catholic at the time period coming in the 1840s. Well, if you take a look at it really closely, right around this time period of 1860s, you'll see that we have this interesting phenomenon happen right there. Just look at the cascading, like boom, all of a sudden going down, 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 down. And then all of a sudden it goes strikingly up right around that time period, right there. So we can get it to go right down, then, and that is right after that actual time period where we said, hey, we're going to give 160 acres to anybody who wants to live on it for 5 years, the Homestead Act. And that brings about in the northern states a kind of Nina stuff. You'll see these advertised on help wanted signs. No Irish need apply. Now, later we'll apply that to the Catholic Italians so they can keep their little eye on there. No Italians need apply. And then they can keep it for later on in the future, maybe when we build a bigger wall across the Atlantic and say no Icelanders need apply or whatever they want comes. Anyway, so the eyes are going to be as part of this time period where you have a whole bunch of things happening in America where there's this fear that somehow or another those people are going to steal America out from underneath us. So what happens then is an ironic thing we talked about a little bit last time is that having come to America looking for their 160 acres of homestead free land, the Irish then are stuck in these manufacturing cities, New York and Baltimore and other places, Philadelphia, Boston, where they now are going to be then drafted in the army and they end up having draft riots and they break out in the 1863 time period. They inflame New York, but up here in the upper part, and you can't see where I'm pointing, up there in the upper part, what you're going to have is in modern day Harlem, that's where the poor Irish are going to be living right next to the poor free blacks. And as a sad commentary on the social elements of the Civil War that are going to bleed over into the Reconstruction time period, you're going to end up having the killing of black people that many of the Irish saw now as the result and the reason that they're being drafted. So these draft riots are going to pop up in the time period. They're going to carry on from years after this. So one of the social elements of Reconstruction is the North is going to have its own black people, and they're going to often be referred to as the Black Irish in the North. And so the Black Irish are going to be the Irish who've come in for the worst of all jobs, and they're basically going to be digging canals and horrible work like that. They've been doing it for a long time, as opposed to the blacks in the South. So you have, in essence, your go-to workforce, the lowest of the low in the South, the freedmen, the lowest of the low in the North, the Irish. And it's going to be an element that is going to be very similar in this time period. Now, if you take a look at this, this is basically just a chart that is going to show you the population of whites versus blacks in South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, all the way down to Missouri. And as you can tell, there's going to be basically two states, South Carolina and Mississippi, are going to have a disproportionately majority of blacks that are now free because of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. Obviously, this is going to be a challenge, especially when you now, up to the 14th and 15th Amendment, allow black citizens to vote, and it is a simple majority base. So what we have in this time period then is going to be a big push to keep blacks from voting, from having rights on the part of the Southern whites, and a big push on the radical Republicans to let blacks have all the same rights that white people in the South have then sometimes been stripped of, especially if they took any kind of role in the Confederate Army or the Confederate States of America's government. One of the things that passed in 1865 is the Freedmen's Bureau, and it passes Congress with radical Republican support and push that is going to be basically designed to help blacks kind of acclimatize themselves to the new reality they find themselves in. It'll help them understand how to read, write, and as you can tell, this woman over here is a northerner who's gone down to help bring these people up into the modern age, tell them how to read, how to write. You can see some older people in the background, older kids, maybe even adults. They're also going to try to help them with contracts and all kinds of different things. Remember, prior to the Civil War, in most of the southern states, it had become illegal after Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831 to ever teach a black person to read and write, punishable by death in a handful of states. So what we have then is this kind of need for blacks to be educated. So these Freedmen's Bureaus are being paid for by taxpayer dollars, and they become very controversial for many northern whites, definitely controversial for southern whites. As you can tell in this cartoon we saw before, where this idle black man is just sitting around doing nothing while the white man works his butt off all over the place. If you think closely and clearly, you can hear echoes of the debates over welfare even into this time period that are similar to this time period of 1865, 66, 67. The idea that my tax dollars are going to pay for those people doing nothing but sitting around and lazing on the couch all day watching Netflix or playing video games. So the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be basically vetoed by Southern president now, Andrew Johnson, who was there as a legacy of Lincoln's assassination. But he'll veto it over and over again. And in different places, like in Memphis in 1866, as you can read here, as a memorial says, mobs of white men led by law enforcement, policemen of the area, attacked black people in this town. At the end of the attack, the mobs had killed an estimated 46 black people, raped several black women, and committed numerous robberies, assaults, and arsons. A congressional investigation committee reported that 4 churches, 12 schools, and 91 other dwellings were burned by angry whites in this time period. And it became a rallying cry that will then push for the 14th Amendment. So what you have then is a kind of a guerrilla war that is taking place in the South after the Civil War is over in an attempt to keep blacks from having control of society, or at least a portion of control of society, versus the whites that actually had always had control of society. So the 13th Amendment again gives freedom. Remember, that's got to pass through the House and the Senate, and then it's going to go through 3/4 of the states. You had this all memorized in 8th grade. That's going to happen in this time period between the Congress coming into second session after the election of 1864 and then Lincoln's death, and then into the time period. The 14th Amendment is going to be a little bit different. The 14th Amendment is not about freedom, it is about equality. And it's going to pass the House in June of 1866, and it's going to pass the states in July of 1868. So you now have equality. So technically, equality means also the right to be able to vote. Well, Andrew Johnson is going to fight this everywhere he can, and this political cartoon will show you in essence that here he is as King Andrew. So that is a play on the idea of Andy or Andrew Jackson. So he's King Andy, so it's not Andrew anymore. But this is the same idea they did with Andrew Jackson. So you have Andrew Johnson sitting as the Imperero, and all these men are being kind of led out, kind of like Reign of Terror style, to be guillotined from the radical Republicans. And if you look closely over here, then you see Lady Liberty is kind of weeping as she herself is in chains. So this is obviously a northern radical Republican kind of minded cartoon. It's going to show you that element. Right here you have, in essence, Andrew Johnson, President of the United States, saying that when it comes to issues like the 14th and 15th Amendment, you should let the 11 southern states also vote. That's why it says 36 states versus 25 states. Take 36 minus 25, you're going to have your 11. Over here you have basically Thaddeus Stevens and his little bottle of anger, and frustration. This is the congressional train, and they've come, in essence, to an impasse. It is pretty obvious what they're looking at in the background then is going to be the kind of the metaphor of the transcontinental railroad between the Union Pacific and Central Pacific coming together. And so that's the idea. Again, anytime you see a white, linen, bearded person in a kind of a disgruntled, grumbly, kind of dirty look, it's going to end up being basically a metaphor of a Southerner at the time period, a Confederate Southerner at the time. In his own State of the Union address, I think we read a little bit of this in the last thing, he talked about the idea, Andrew Johnson did, that if we are continuing to basically try to recreate the South so that the black people will be on top, the white people will be on bottom, in essence, it not only is wrong in the eyes of God, because right here, as he says, there's never been in the history of the world, he obviously didn't know his African history and the great nations of Africa and the time period of the 1200s, 1100s, 13, 1400s. But anyways, he says that contrary, wherever they've been able to left to their own devices, black people, they've shown a constant tendency to relapse into barbarism. The great characteristic between the two races in physical, mental, and moral characteristics will prevent an amalgamation, a fusing, a merging of the fusion of them together in one homogeneous mass. If the inferior, black, obtains the ascendancy over the other, the whites, it will then govern with reference only to its own interest and will recognize no common interest. In other words, black people vote only to help black people. Sounds familiar. White people only voting to help white people. Slavery and things like that. But anyways, I guess what comes around goes around. Already the Negroes are influenced by promise of confiscation and blunder. They are taught to regard it as an enemy every white man who has ever respect for his rights of his own race. If this continues, it must be worse and worse and worse until all order will be subverted, all industry cease, and the fertile fields of the South will grow up into a wilderness. Of all the dangers our nation have encountered, this is the worst of all, and it's going to cost us like so much money to do this. So this is Andrew Johnson in his State of the Union address in 1867, which is right after having got his butt kicked in 1866 election, where they had lost pretty significantly to the radical Republicans. So when we talk about the elements of social issues, remember there is a feeling on part of freedmen that you guys had a chance to help us out and you totally turned our backs on us. There's whites who then felt like you guys basically forced your system of government down our throats, and that was not what it was supposed to be. So as you can tell over here, you have, in essence, a platform for the 1866 election. The two platforms, every radical in Congress, Republican, voted for Negro suffrage. Remember, suffrage is the right to vote. Every radical in the Pennsylvania area, so we have this time period, right? So let me see if this works. So every radical in the Pennsylvania Senate voted for Negro suffrage. These guys, so in other words, there can be no possible. So which are you going to vote for? Are you going to vote for the white guys, or are you going to vote for, in essence, those guys? So in essence, that's what we're talking about during this time period, is this idea that these are going to be the kind of challenges of the time. So in the 1866 election, radical Republicans are going to win big, and what they remember, 1866, so this is politics, but it's going to help out. In 1866, 2/3, they have the ability to basically override anything that actually in Congress gets vetoed by the president. And so at that point, then they add in not only the 14th Amendment, but then the 15th Amendment that is going to give the right of voting to black people in the South also. So this then is going to be the time where ex-Confederate States of America vets, sometimes they're government guys, are not going to be allowed to vote, but now the black man has the suffrage right to vote. And if you look closely over here in the corner, he's carrying his little Union hat in his background. In other words, the idea that black people, especially those who fought for the Union, are going to be able to vote. So this is a constitutional amendment, 13th, 14th, 15th. You need to remember the 13th, 14th, 15th long time. 13th is emancipation of slavery. 14th is equality, and then 15th is the amendment that really is not necessary because the 14th Amendment already covers the idea of the right to vote. It's embedded kind of within it. It's implied that if you are equal, and if white people have the right to vote, then black people have the right to vote. But it tells you something that radical Republicans really pushed forward for the 15th Amendment. They need to have a political presence in the South of actual black voters. So this brings about what is often known as radical rule. And again, now blacks are going to start to share the governments in the actual South. So think Sacramento, think Albany. So their state governments are going to be a mixture of sometimes radical Republicans and then blacks that have been voted for the first time. This is called radical rule, and what you're often sometimes going to hear it is black rule in the time period. And you're going to see a number of African Americans serving in Congress. And there's two senators, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce. So these two guys, Hiram Revels is going to be up here, and he's going to be a senator, and then Blanche Bruce, and they're going to actually be senators, and then a handful of congressmen in the time period. So this is all radical rule, and it is obviously going to infuriate many racists in the country, especially in the South. Now, we also talk about the idea with economics that the South has been just devastated by incredible, horrible, runaway hyperinflation. We also talk about the idea that the South is a very profitable area. The land itself is profitable. So you have these carpetbaggers from the North coming down to use their money to buy up old, broken down Southern things, and then scallywags are working with them. So there's a feeling on the part of the South that their economies collapse. They're not having any economic system. Their money is no longer worth anything. There's no Hamilton's assumption plan for the South at the end of the war. In other words, they're utterly economically devastated. And like vultures from the Southern perspective, like vultures come these carpetbaggers, taking advantage of our misery. That North then is going to occupy us militarily, and then eventually, as those Southern areas then adopt the 15th Amendment, along with the 13th and 14th, they've been allowed to come back in under the time period. Now notice, the date of reestablishment of conservative rule is going to be the bottom date on here. In essence, that means when did that state get turned over back to the people of the state, and the armies then leave. So for a little time period, 3 years, 5 years in some cases, these areas were controlled by military occupation, and there are soldiers down there. Now, if you notice, Louisiana is 1877, South Carolina is 1876, and Florida is 1877. So you have three states, and this will be important in our next lecture, that are still in essence controlled by the Army in this time period. So the carpetbaggers are going to be then challenged by people in the South that are often going to be known as the white liners, and those are the people that want to bring in white governments only, and democratic white governments only, and they want to kick out the black politicians and the radical Republican white Southerners. And so you have our yellow dog Democrats, and we'll talk about this a little bit with our next lecture about politics in the time period. So we have these yellow dog Democrats that will vote only for the Democratic Party, and they'll continue to do so all the way into the 1960s with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 by President Southerner Lyndon Baines Johnson. So a big word you need to know, have down, is the idea of redemption. And redemption means is to redeem the honor, the tradition of the South, to bring back Southern white rule, to push blacks back down to their inferior status, as they had been telling themselves through their religion, through everything else in the time period, that's where God wanted them. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. So redemption, in essence, is this idea that the South will eventually rise again. Why I get hiccups every time when I start doing stuff? I have no idea why. It's like a nervous hiccup thing. Anyways, so the South will rise again is the mindset. And this will be kind of the foundation later on, even of the Gone with the Wind movie. The idea that the North devastated the South and they'll rise again. This idea of like Scarlett O'Hara saying, I will not be beaten. I will this, that, and the other. So in this era of race, remember, we have an issue of racism. This is me and my family, my oldest son, Nathan, my middle son, Jason, and then I'm personal best friends with Abraham Lincoln. and Frederick Douglass. We are all buds. We go out and on Friday afternoons, well after work is over, we basically drink lemonade together. So, anyways, this is the time period where it's important to remember that I saw this in a handful of kind of the back windows of trucks when I went to this Civil War reenactment. And I saw this right there. It's a Southern thing. Y'all wouldn't understand it. In other words, this is something that happened in the South. When it comes to social issues, it is important to remember that the Civil War was our biggest war, 620,000 plus people dead. That is almost a number that all the wars we fight put together basically pass that only by a little. So the worst war we fought with ourselves. And when we talk about the idea of the United States having a completely unbeaten record when it comes to wars, except for Vietnam, and you can haggle over that one, it's important to remember that for 1/3 of the country, the biggest war we ever fought, they didn't win. And they were, in essence, forced to remake their society for a time period that they call basically radical rule, Reconstruction. And so for Southerners, it's a tough one because it's embedded in their actual kind of social way of looking at themselves. And remember, Dixie is going to be, in essence, this idea of anything below the Mason-Dixon line. And so this is a really popular song. If we were in class, we'd be actually playing it while you guys came in. And it's been remade over and over and over. Jerry Reed is one of the ones that I listen to when we're in class, and it talks about the idea of you are from Dixie and you're picking cotton and you're doing that kind of stuff, the cotton fields. So anything below that Mason-Dixon line, in other words, those Confederate states. When we even get into the Southern era of the Civil Rights Movement and you start seeing in Birmingham, Alabama, blacks being kind of washed down the street or attacked by police dogs. In the midst of this, you're going to have a song come out by Neil Young that, in essence, talks about the idea that later on Leonard Skinner is going to then come back to. And in Neil Young's song, Alabama, he talks about the idea of Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama. Why is this happening to you? You've got to get past your past. And then Leonard Skinner comes out in their own song, Sweet Home Alabama. And they talk about the idea that basically Southern man has nothing that he's got to be afraid of and ashamed of. This is part of our heritage. Another song that comes out in this time period, which is a really kind of interesting one, Forrest Gump. If you ever watched this great movie, Tom Hanks hopefully is coronavirus free by now. He, in essence, has a reference where he is named after Nathan Bedford Forrest, one of the most celebrated cavalry generals of the Civil War. And in Nathan Bedford Forrest, he instead doesn't do what Edmund Ruffin does. Edmund Ruffin kills himself when he hears that Lee has surrendered. Nathan Bedford Forrest and a bunch of his friends, in essence, go off to establish the KKK. And so in this time period, there's a song that would be listening to in class. It has been redone every time over the decades, and it's still being released every once in a while. And it talks about the idea that we are Southerners, and we wish that we had gotten 3 million of you Northerners instead of what we got. And I'm not going to be reunited. I don't give a damn. I'm not going to love this Constitution no matter what you got. So socially, there's a kind of anger that has never quite gone away from the old South. And it's taken them a long time to kind of get over this. And it then wraps itself tightly around the spoke wheels of race. And so for the South to understand the South, we really need to be able to understand what it is that has happened down there. And the idea that we need these people to be picking the cotton until later combustion engines bring about the idea that this is going to be done more cheaply by other means. So we have the idea of the 13th Amendment, that as a punishment for a crime, you can be put into slavery. And that, in essence, is going to be part of the black code that we talk about, the Jim Crow laws that were designed to keep blacks down as second-class citizens. And then this is the element of Reconstruction, with the KKK coming in and finding ways through the white leaders, people who are going to basically keep blacks down but aren't going to use violence, hand in hand, working along with the KKK that's using all kinds of violence. You got a revolver, and a knife, and and in the background you see over here is the idea of a schoolhouse in the background being kind of burned, and over here on this side, a man being lynched. So what does it take to keep the African American down, in essence? And the great civil rights leader, the emancipation person, the man who freed himself, Frederick Douglass, one of my personal friends again, said, in essence, as a result of Reconstruction, when everything was said and done, the slave was freed in name only. And the white liners were here, it says in the background, as the school is burned down, and this man is crying over his child and his wife and his other friends. So when it comes to Reconstruction, what happens as a result is, in essence, blacks are going to be turned out. And if you look really closely here on the bottom, you're going to see that the very last name on here is George White. So here would have been a question on our quiz because it's a obviously, speedwell kind of thing. The last congressman of the 1800s to serve as an element, a remnant of the radical Reconstruction was George White. Picture of him right there. Obviously, George White. Here's your play on words. The last black congressman had to be George White. Way to remember it. So now we have this political cartoon that shows these elements of what's happening. You have a Irish man from the north. They always look like an albino monkey. This is a Thomas Nast cartoon. A Confederate States of America former soldier with the lost cause he's going for, and then northerner looking with his capital book, his money book over here. And in essence, they're standing on a black former Union soldier. You can tell by his hat. He's been trampled. He's proudly holding on a last-ditch effort to the flag he was probably given for leaving the service, and he's reaching for this. And this will be important for our next thing. That, again, is going to be the symbol of any voting thing. It was a ballot box. You would take this little lid off. You could put your votes in. It was glass, so everyone would see that you didn't put too many votes in. You didn't try to stuff the ballot box. So ballots are, in essence, not a secret thing. They're a very public thing, and people will be able to see what it is that you voted for and how you voted. Now, for our carryover to our next lecture, African Americans are going to routinely, consistently vote for the Republican Party. They're the counterbalance to like the yellow dog Democrats. What they're going to do is they're going to vote the party of Father Abraham. And they will vote very consistently when they are allowed to vote Republican all the way up into the 1930s and the Great Depression and the New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We'll hit that when we get there. So when we get to the idea of voting, we'll come out back to this idea, but it comes into like an overlap of social affiliation with the African American voters of today and this idea of race. Race is going to be very determinant to elements, including, and we'll talk about this in more detail on our next lecture, even to today's race. All right, so let's then get to this part. And this part is going to be the sad part. If you look carefully here, you can see a man has been hanged. But if you look really carefully over here, right in the background, the bars, that's a jail. And then this is the official hangman's platform where a trapdoor would open. The person with the noose around their neck with a little bit of slack in the line would then fall, and the weight of their body, pulled by gravity, in essence, would then snap their neck. Hanging was designed to be a relatively quick way to kill someone. This over here, that's different. This, in essence, ladies and gentlemen, is where you would take a rope, put it over a high spot, and this man then would be hoisted off the ground, and his own weight would slowly put pressure on the noose that would then suffocate the person being, in essence, lynched. Ladies and gentlemen, this is known as lynching, and lynching is different than hanging. Lynching, in essence, is where you purposely torture someone. It's one of the most excruciating forms of death. Your body, as it's suffocating and running out of air, literally feels it's drowning in air, and all your cells start firing off horrible kind of please help us, death kind of nervous energy to the brain. It is a horribly traumatic way to die. And so one of the things we're going to talk about as the KKK is literally born in 1867, as a result of the Civil War, is the idea of trying to keep the black man down. Now, I remember when I was little thinking that the burning of the cross was some sort of like anti-Christian thing. And when I heard a handful of kind of interviews with actual Klansmen, for them, it was very symbolic. It is the burning, piercing, fiery justice of Christ in a black sea of suffocation for the Southerners in the kind of legacy of the radical rule. The idea that we have been forced, as Andrew Johnson said, to the bottom of the social pyramid, and blacks have been elevated to the top. And this is going to be God's wrath on America in the time. So what you have then is, wow, my nose really is big in this. Anyways, you have, in essence, in this time period of the 1870s following Reconstruction, a move towards finding a way to keep blacks as second-class citizens. They have the right to vote as of the 15th Amendment. They have all equal rights as opposed to the 14th Amendment. And anybody remembers anything from 8th grade, federal laws, federal constitutional laws trump state black code, Jim Crow laws. So there should have been no question. But the Northern government will not enforce the equality of blacks in the South in this time period. So to keep blacks from trying to fight for their own equality, what you're going to end up starting to see in this time period is sadly a flurry of lynchings that are going to occur from all kinds of places. And the lynchings, again, are not hangings. They're a vigilante type issue where they're going to, I'm just going to give you a heads up, this is not going to be a series of fun slides. These slides are going to be tough to get through, but they are part of our story. So throughout the South and often, sadly, Midwest, you're going to end up having these lynchings occur by the hundreds, by the thousands. And sometimes there's even the idea that the black man is so much better than the white man and everything that's been going on. And so you'll often see in these things where they've actually stripped the black man. They'll take pictures of them kind of to prove that in this moment of death, as the person is dying, everything, including the man's genitalia, in essence, is going to go into shock. And basically, they're going to be proven to be not anything better than the white man. It's like, so you're going to see pictures of these things over and over again at the time period where people will be stripped naked, in essence, in a way to prove that they're not more manly than we are. See, look at how small everything is. Well, that's what the body does as the body's getting ready to die. And so you'll see in these pictures over and over again, these humiliations, not enough to actually have tortured this person to death. You have to humiliate them in the process. And sometimes they would castrate them, cut off their penis, cut off their testicles, whatever happens to be the case. And I can tell in the background, here's a young boy. These guys are kind of like, what else do you do on a Sunday afternoon, I guess? Lynch somebody who has been accused of something. So not given a trial by jury. They don't generally just grab black people off the street, but they'll have been accused of something. But sometimes by the hundreds, by the thousands over the years, there'll be these lynchings that will take place in the time period. And the lynchings will often not be of just men, but sometimes even women who also were kind of a threat to white power in the time period. This picture actually shows a husband and a wife being hanged in Oklahoma. And this is 1911, actually, over here. So this is going to go well into the 20th century. Sometimes they would actually lynch a number of them. There were reports of gambling where they kind of bet who would be the last one to, stop kicking and struggling for air. And you can tell these guys in the background, they're just kind of laughing at this stuff. It's like this fun thing somehow or another, protecting the overall white race. Now, from 1882 all the way to 1968, we're going to have a whole lot, hundreds and hundreds of lynchings in this time period. And as this time period goes, what you'll start to see is that this is sometimes done in mass, in big numbers of people. And they're not always necessarily black people. They're also going to be in the 19-teens, 1920s, immigrants coming from Eastern Europe, Jewish people, Italians, Irish, Irish not so much by this time period. And they'll often be public affairs where they're going to actually have these things happening as these big groups. And again, with increasing frequency in the 1920s and 19-teens, it won't just be black people. It would be pretty much anybody who's been accused of a crime of pushing and kind of this vigilante justice, like you had it coming. But again, it's amazing to me that they're actually posing for these things. Here's a man who was burned alive. And as you can tell, it is after the World War I time period. So we're talking about the 1920s. And just look at the faces. These men just kind of actually having a great time, stoking the fire, kind of enjoying themselves, literally posing for this. I can't even imagine being present at something like this, let alone being so proud that you want to get yourself kind of muscled up to the front to be able to take a picture. Somebody must have said, like, let this little guy through so he can get his picture in there too. Sometimes they would hang the person, lynch the person, and burn the person, as this particular thing goes. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but this is a postcard made of this. So this is the front of the postcard. This is the back of the postcard. This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left with a cross over it. Yours truly, Joe. So somebody raced to get these things printed by the Katy Electric Studio, Temple, Texas. Somebody raced to get this thing done so that they would have them for the following morning. Sometimes in the background, you'll actually see of these hangings, in the foreground, you're going to see African-American men who have actually been part of the thing and actually taking part of it, trying to prove in essence, I'm not one of those who's trying to challenge the system. This one to me is probably one of the most disturbing, second to most disturbing. If you look closely at these two men that have been hanged, again, this guy was stripped. Young teens look like maybe in their 20s, the most. Look over here. Not only this guy with his little mini Hitler mustache kind of pointing, this will happen to you in case, you do this also. But look over here. I mean, if you look at it closely, these people over here, if I can get it to do its thing, right? They're holding hands. It's like a date. This guy's with the U.S. Army. They're over here. They beat this guy up in the 1920s and 30s. And so this legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction is going to be the foundation of our modern kind of civil rights movement. And the thing that really kind of disturbs me most, I think, with these is these people. Somebody brought their little girls to witness this man. I, I lynchings in the South. And they're not just happening in the South, they're going to happen in the Midwest also. But in the South from 1877 to 1950s, overall victims, hundreds, thousands of them. And those are the ones that we know that have been reported. So, in this one, for those who read Great Gatsby, you remember Tom Buchanan, I think, in that, talking about the idea of the white race and stuff, right? He killed Earl's grandma. She was Florence's mother. Get us to Bud from Aunt Myrtle. So Aunt Myrtle is sending this song. This was the maid in the courtyard in the center of Texas. It's a 16-year-old black boy, 16-year-old black boy who killed Earl's grandma somehow or another, maybe. Probably there was no trial to prove that he did it, if you remember reading To Kill a Mockingbird. I like this one here. The answer, the Anglo-Saxon race to the black brutes who would attack the womanhood of the South. Find a way to metaphor this idea of a black man raping the entire South as a woman, and you can have this knight in shining armor then go out and do what a man does. This one always got me when I saw this one for the first time. Here's a dad proudly posing with probably his 3 sons, maybe a 4th, dressed up for the day. I'm very, very, very proud of my family and my 3 sons, my wonderful wife, best part of our family. I can't ever really imagine the idea of having them learn a life lesson that you got to stand up for your race. You got to stand up for your people, and bringing them at this young little age. I cannot even imagine bringing him to be part of something like this. Killing of a 16-year-old boy without a trial, simply because he was a black man. Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to then even kind of bleed over into the area of race when it comes to the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision in 1896. Homer Plessy was an African-American man who was riding in a whites-only car in the South on a train, and he was told by the conductor that he's got to get off and go to the black colored section of the train, and he, in essence, refused. Like a lot of other Supreme Court decisions, this is actually Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy was purposely picked by the train company, in essence, to ride their trains and attempt to be arrested so that they could find a way to have the Supreme Court overturn the Black Code Jim Crow laws of the South that enforced the idea that once these trains came from the North, which is a first-class train and a second-class train and a economy coach train car, they would have to then put on a black only, white only kind of series of cars, and it was expensive. So in essence, they more or less hired Homer Plessy to basically ride, get arrested, and then challenge the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will eventually hear it. What's interesting to me is that most of the Supreme Court by 1896 had been appointed by the Republican Party that had kind of championed himself for a little moment in time as being the party of black men and equality, 14th, 15th Amendment. And they will find in this ruling that as long as you, in essence, separate the races, it's okay. Separate but equal. When it comes to social issues, it's really tough because it's going to also be part of the idea that this goes back in some people's minds as far back as the idea that segregation is part of what God wants in the world. And there are people in this country right now, this time, for those of you watching this that may believe this, okay? Freedom of religion allows us to basically disagree with each other over our religious beliefs. I'm pretty certain God's not playing a race game, but there are people in the country who believe it very strongly that there is a kind of race and God likes white people better than. And so you'll hear in our civil rights movement when we talk about it later on, this kind of idea that they're being segregated, and that's all part of God's plan, going back to Genesis and the idea that God has separated the animals and has separated even the races according to their kinds, according to their races, according to their kinds. And this even goes back to the curse of Noah on Ham. It's called the curse of Ham sometimes. And the story of after the flood, where Noah, in essence, and his 3 sons and his wife and their 3 wives, in essence, are attempting to repopulate the earth. And as the story goes, basically Ham comes in and notices his father Noah naked, which is a big no-no ever since, the flooding of the earth. And if this story is true, which is up to your belief system, you can imagine that Noah would take this pretty seriously. Noah's sons would take this pretty serious. You don't piss off God because we've just lived through the 40 days and 40 nights and all humanity being wiped out and every living thing other than the two on our boat. So they find him naked, and in essence, as the story goes, they then walk back into his tent and throw a blanket over him. And then when Noah wakes up, he's angry and wants to know what the heck happened. And in essence, the two brothers said, well, Ham saw you naked. And then basically the idea is that Noah will then curse Ham with the idea that as you then go in this presence, your sons, Ham's sons, will then be the future servants of your brothers. And that even goes into, from Southern kind of expectations and explanations of race in the South, the idea that God had in essence separated the descendants of Ham, and they will become then eventually the people that live in Africa. And as the earth repopulates itself, and again, if you believe the Noah story, then everybody came from Noah and his wife and his three sons. They all came from Adam and Eve, but then it kind of got reset. And so the idea for many people, still in the country to this day, is that the actual people that will be Ham's descendants are the black people. And they've been cursed by, in essence, Noah, i.e., cursed by God to be the actual servants for the two brothers. In other words, the black people will be the servants of everybody else in the world. And somehow or another, that's the way God wants it. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, this is going to take us all the way into ultimately even the Charlottesville riots of 2017. I don't know if you remember, right after President Trump had been elected and then brought to the presidency in January 20th of 2017, there's a protest over the taking down of a Confederate statue, Robert E. Lee, and the idea that these men came with their tiki torches bought at the Lowe's or maybe possibly the local Home Depot, did their kind of pseudo-Nazi-esque torchlight neo-Nazi white nationalism thing. And if you look in the crowd, it's tough to find any women, and it is distinctly tough to find any other races. Maybe if you look really close, you can find them. But their chant in this process that was recorded, this anger-filled chant, was the idea that you will not replace us. And they then threw in for alliteration, kind of like a little bit of a rhyming scheme, Jews will not replace us. But think about it from a white Southern perspective or a white perspective in general. It doesn't have to be in the South. It could be anywhere in the United States. Racism isn't a necessary region-specific thing. But in the lifetime of many people still living, they've seen the greatest get basically replaced by black people. You know, Babe Ruth being replaced ultimately by Barry Bonds and a handful of other people in the midst. Steffi Graf being replaced by Serena and Venus Williams. Our first black president. Also half white president. His mom was from Kansas. But the idea of race in America and the whole birther movement, led often by, at the time period, private citizen Donald Trump, that he was obviously not from the United States. He'd been born in Kenya or some other place. And that was the whole birther movement kind of the 2009 through. It never quite went away. And it was part of the story. And the idea that even in the midst of this, Larry Klayman, who heads the group Freedom Watch, was pleased when he saw Trump's handling of a conspiratorial question on Thursday evening during a town hall meeting in New Hampshire. The way Trump responded last night, I think, was appropriate, he said. Trump's appropriate response came after a questioner declared his thoughts about a real problem in the United States. It's called Muslim, said the man. You know, our current president is one. You know, he's not even an American. Anyway, we have a training camps growing where they will want to kill us, he continued. That's my question. When can we get rid of them? Trump's answer was uncharacteristically ambivalent. We're going to be looking at a lot of different things, Trump replied. You know, a lot of people are saying that, and a lot of people are saying that bad things are happening. We're going to be looking at that and many other things. This issue of racism is even going to bleed over to the idea of the Hamilton musical, where we see Lin-Manuel Miranda and the producers purposely decide to cast all of the people as being something other than white. So even our white founding fathers are going to be then cast by non-white actors, including George Washington, that really threw some people off. Ladies and gentlemen, this story of race is going to be even bleeding over into our local area. We had an ardent, fair racial killer, man, Joseph Paul Leonard, who drew a prison term of 32 years to life for fatally running over a black man with his truck in 2013. So you guys were born. You were around just a while ago, taken into custody when he was then caught. In essence, he says, by a sheriff's deputy, that Leonard said in remarks taped on the patrol car video camera, just because we got Obama for president, these people think they're real special. Leonard also used racial slurs in the patrol car, and as witnesses said, also in the moments after his arrest. Ladies and gentlemen, race as the main element of the social part of Reconstruction is very simple. For a little teeny moment in time, which we're going to cover in the next lecture, Black people were given equality. American dream. All men, all people, created equal. And for the sake of politics and the sake of economics, the S gets stuck in the middle of the ESP, totally eliminated. And the South is allowed to basically unleash their anger of having lost this climactic civil war on the people that they had convinced themselves that God wanted below them. Here's the sad thing I learned from history. You can see it evidenced from anything from Nazi Germany on through to our current time period. Hate is an amazingly powerful motivator when it comes to politics. Just takes a little bit of energy to turn it on. But I don't think people are designed to hate. So when you restructure reality to configure the idea that there's somebody worthy of your hate, it's hard to get that to go away. That reality sometimes will take generations to change. That's the legacy of Civil War, Reconstruction, and our failed promise to our fellow Americans that through slavery helped make this country incredibly rich. Anyways, we'll be talking about more things. Thanks for hanging in there.